So let's begin. Welcome to Echoes of Steel, a history of European martial arts, presented by South Coast Swords. I am the principal curator, Myles Cupp. So let me tell you a little bit about my background of how this sort of began. I started fencing about 15 years ago. I started in Olympic sport fencing. When I came to Cal State Fullerton, there was a club for historical fencing, the CSUF Medieval Swordsmanship Club, and it's still going strong today. After that, I graduated electrical engineering. I'm actually working as a part-time faculty in that department. My day job, I'm a controls engineer at Disneyland. And on the weekends and whenever else I can help out, I'm an instructor at South Coast Swords, which is a historical European martial arts school located near and in Costa Mesa. So let's begin with the narrative that we're going to tell. The title of this exhibit is Echoes of Steel, a history of European martial arts. By the Echoes of Steel, I am trying to indicate to you guys that what happened far in the past is still affecting us today. The clanging of swords, the clashing of steel, we can still hear those echoes. And I'm going to begin with the earliest documented martial arts that we know about, continue all the way up into the trenches of World War I, sort of the end of living memory, or the beginning of living memory of martial arts, I should say, because unfortunately there are no more World War I veterans who survive today. So we can sort of branch off where history and our current time begins at World War I. That's why we stopped there. So we're going to trace the development of the history of European martial arts from that kind of perspective, looking at all of European society and history through that lens. Now, I call it a history of European martial arts because it's not the only history that we could tell. I could have structured this exhibit around dueling. I could have structured it around armies. I could have picked any one of those and run a thread and gone crazy with it. But to have focused in on any one of those details, I felt would have missed the huge picture that is there, because to focus on one, you have to neglect something else. So we tried to squeeze in as much of that narrative as we could. So let's talk briefly about what our methodology is for studying historical martial arts. What are our sources? So this is a chart that I borrowed from Richard Marsden of the Phoenix Society of Historical Swordsmanship. When you look at martial arts treatises and sources, some are more relevant and some are more reliable than others. At the bottom of the hierarchy, you have experimental archaeology. You pick up a sword and you say, okay, kind of makes sense to swing it like this. That would be at the bottom. We're just guessing at what makes sense with that weapon. We do that for Viking martial arts, we do that for Roman martial arts, we do that for ancient Greek martial arts because they didn't tell us how they fought. No sources survive, unfortunately. If you go a level higher, you can look at mythology, you can look at historical accounts. You go another level up, you can look at secondhand treatises, people in the past who studied what they were doing and what they said about it. You can go to first-hand accounts and period artwork, like a soldier who wrote a diary and said, I did these things in these battles, or I fought a duel in this way and I won. All the way up to period treatises where an actual master of fencing or martial arts is going to say, these are the things that you do. That will clearly be much more reliable for us than the experimental archaeology down at the bottom. Off to the side of this hierarchy going from least reliable to most reliable, we need to always be thinking about the context. It's not enough to just say, these are the techniques that people use. We need to understand why they were using it. Why would they have fought in this way? Because martial arts are constrained by the society in which they take place. And that's going to bring me to the next slide that begins the narrative. Let's go back into the deepest past. Let's look at humanity and what humanity is. Human beings are martial by nature. And by that I mean that martial arts are a manifestation of mankind's struggle with nature. Hunting, struggling against the elements, that is encapsulated in the development of martial arts. Man also struggles with his fellow man. Competition over resources, competition over mates, competition over territory. Humans struggle against other humans. And then finally, man also struggles with his own soul. I'll make an analogy from the book of Genesis. Jacob, in a dream, wrestled with God. And then after that, he changed his name and became Israel, which means he who wrestles with God. So this very concept of wrestling, martial struggle, even against one's own consciousness, we can see that manifested in our physical exertions that we call martial arts. And it stretches as far back into the past as you want to go. Evidence of the earliest wrestling techniques dating back to the 15,000 BC in Mongolian cave art. We can also look at Egyptian tomb art that depicts wrestling systems. One of the best examples of this is at the tomb site located at Beni Hassan of Becket III, approximately 2000 BC. Every single one of those wrestling positions can be identified in a modern wrestling system to within 95, maybe 100% identical technique. So we can see that even in ancient Egyptian society, they had highly developed systems of martial arts. What exactly those techniques represent and how one would do them, they didn't say, they just depicted the artwork. But we know how we wrestle today because the human body can only move in so many different ways. So we can connect that thread from us back to them. If we go further along in our narrative, we can know that as human society developed, hunters and gatherers settled down into permanent settlements, tribes become city-states, city-states become kingdoms, and then kingdoms become empires. Organized militaries projected the power of those empires both politically and economically. The best example of this is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire controlled all of the known world of their time, right up to the border, and beyond that was uncivilized territory that they didn't really want anyway, from their point of view. Specific documentation of their techniques, while sparse, that legacy of their martial power continued in the imagination of Europeans for centuries, millennia. I'll read you a quote from Major Anthony Gordon, 1805, quoting Vegetius, 450 AD approximately. And by the way, a 1478 printing of Vegetius' treatise is on display in this exhibit, and that's why I want it. So the quote says, "The Romans owed the conquest of the world to their preeminence in the use of the sword and to a rigid discipline. We were at all times inferior to the Africans in the resources of wealth and stratagem, and to the Greeks in all arts and sciences. But by an unremitting cultivation of the hand weapon, and by a judicious selection and instruction of recruits in the science of defense, the Romans conquered the world." That's Vegetius' words coming from Major Gordon. Paulus Hectormeyer, writing in 1540, wrote that the worthy Romans did place their trust, hope, and refuge in the knightly art of fencing, even at the time of most dire need, as testified by Julius Caesar himself. These are later authors describing their perceptions of what Rome meant to them. Military power, martial power. That continued even during the Dark Ages, and we begin to see the earliest written down fencing treatises begin to emerge in the 1300s. Perhaps they existed earlier than that. Unfortunately, we haven't found any. Hopefully we'll find some more very soon. So what we're looking at right now is the manuscript 133, also known as the Walpurgis manuscript, or Walpurgis Fechtbook, or the Tower manuscript, because for a period of time it was kept in the Tower of London. This book is interesting to us because it shows sword and buckler combat as taught from clerics to students, and it's called the Walpurgis Fechtbook because the last few pages show this woman that's only identified as Walpurgis fencing with the instructing monk. Was Walpurgis a real woman who learned from the monk? Is it a symbolic representation? Unfortunately, we will never truly know. But it gives us an idea of this rich heritage of martial arts that had to have already been in existence for a treatise like this that is so complete and detailed to have been produced. As those rich oral traditions from years past that we can infer exist got written down, we begin to see the threads that were stretching farther back into the past. Let me begin by focusing on German master Johannes Lichtenauer. No known works by him are known to have been written. He's kind of like Jesus Christ in the sense that Jesus didn't actually write down anything, but we know what he said from what his disciples, his students, said that he said, where they said, "I was with Jesus and he said this thing, and this is what I thought about it." Johannes Lichtenauer is very much like that. He was a master of fencing who taught techniques to his students through something called the Zettel, which is the recital, that they would remember in a secretive poem. The poem is abstract. It is very difficult to penetrate what it is saying, except for the fact that commentaries on the poetry were written down by his students. So there's a verse, and then this is what that verse means, and it's like a paragraph of text for this one line of that poetic verse. And those surviving commentaries provide us a window into the earliest known lineages of martial tradition of the Middle Ages, early Renaissance, and it was continued through the growth in literacy. These are some illustrations from one of those works written by his students, the Codex Danzig 1452. On the left are two guards, the guard of Pflug, which we can know, they stood like this. How about that? Guard of Oaks, the guard of Alber on the far right, and then the guard of Vom Tag from the shoulder. And in the center is what we believe to be an artistic depiction of what Johannes Lichtenauer himself might have looked like. We'll never know for sure, but it's probably him. Okay, another master in the oral traditions that were written down that I want to talk about is Fior Furlano dei Liberi. Did I say that right? He was a 14th century Italian knight and fencing master. He was also a diplomat and sometimes statesman. He was all over the place in northern Italy during his time. He says in his own works that he traveled to learn his martial arts. He claimed to have learned them from accomplished German and Italian masters from other areas, and when he refused to teach his secret methods to people he felt was unworthy to learn them, they challenged him to duels, he fought them and won. Maybe even killed the people who wanted to learn. So he authored many treatises on combat. I think there are 5 of his that are known to survive. Clear evidence of attention to detail in his treatises. He cared about getting it right because there are so many bits of evidence indicating corrections and edits to his work that you can zoom in real close, see that they scraped it off once, redrew it, no, that's not right, scraped it off again, redrew it, no, that's not right, again, yes, that's it, that's what we want to show. Bits of detail as small as which way that the wrist is oriented in the picture. That makes a difference in the execution of the technique. If you do it the wrong way, you lose. If you do it the way Fior showed to do it, you win. Shows a tremendous amount of sophistication in their understanding of physiology, anatomy, biology, even in the 14th century. And that's the point I want to get across, that they're not brutes with swords bashing each other around. This is a finely developed and tuned art form which gives us a window into their society. They were finely tuned people with a high level of intellectual capacity. So here are some illustrations from one of his surviving manuscripts, the manuscript Ludwig 1513. It's also called the Getty manuscript because it actually resides currently in the Getty Museum right here in Southern California. On the left, they're crossed with the sword in 2 hands. So this is the sword used in 2 hands as opposed to the parts of his treatise on the sword in 1 hand. Shows you how you can grab the sword and kick out the other guy's knee. And he also shows how you can fence from horseback and grab the other guy's sword, get in close and grapple with him. It's a wonderful treatise if you go online and look at the rest of the scans of it. So these were manuscripts, 14th, 15th century. The invention of the printing press spread martial arts knowledge all across Europe. Because when you have a printed book, you can have the master's fencing notes immediately accessible to you. If you want to learn fencing, go to the bookstore, buy a book. Hey, now I've got a book. I can learn how to sword fight from this book. Particularly in a time period where dueling was common all throughout Europe, even though they tried to illegalize it. We'll talk more about dueling in a minute. And self-defense was an important imperative of the burgeoning middle class. As the middle class arises, they are in an interesting position because they are not nobles who can buy on credit for being nobles, right, trading in the markets. So they have to carry their physical currencies around with them, gold, silver, what have you. They're not wealthy enough to hire bodyguards, so how are they going to protect themselves from bandits and robbers? They are going to carry personal self-defense swords, rapiers, shorter versions of swords like these, they would have a big market in buying these kinds of treatises. And one of them is Achille Morozzo's 1536 treatise, Opera Nova, 2 copies of which are on display in this gallery. So we're painting a big picture of all the different contexts that people would use to practice martial arts in. Not just for war, not just the projection of imperial power, but self-defense, fitness, because a gentleman needs to be athletic, as Castiglione told us in the Book of the Courtier. A gentleman must exercise. You can fence for sport. You can fence for spiritual enlightenment. You can get closer to God through fencing, as other masters have told us. In addition to warfare and dueling like we have talked about. Now, one thing I'd like to point out here, you may be wondering, what the heck is going on in this scene? So this is a sword dance from 16th century Germany. There's music. You can see the musicians up there in the upper right. Everybody's dancing around in a circle. Every guy's got his hand on the sword of the guy in front of him. And these guys right here have interlocked their swords with each other, lifted 2 guys up on their shoulders, and then they're fencing up there. Just for fun. Just because that's really cool to do. And it's entertainment, it's sport, it's fitness, it's fun. They enjoy doing it. All right, so let's continue on with seeing how martial arts is impacting the technology of its day and vice versa. So as improvements in metalworking design happen, metalworking improvements being made to get better at winning wars or winning duels, weapon designs also change. Swords go from being simple cruciform style hilts like this to having complex hilts. When you have complex hilts, you can now protect your hand just by having a sword with metal all around your hand, which is going to change the way that you fight. You don't need to have a big sword like this necessarily. Now you can put your point at the other guy and your hand is going to stay safe. And that's going to change the techniques of your fighting. I'm not going to get into all of those different changes. I'm just telling you that they're there. And as the technology continues to change with the adaptation of firearms, the types of combat that you see also get adjusted. Gerard Thibault's 1630 treatise, a plate of which is on display in the gallery, he depicts the first explicit description of how to zigzag against a firearm-wielding opponent. He's still showing you how to beat a guy with a gun with a sword, but he's saying you got to do it this way. It's a change. And finally, as firearms get even better and better, eventually people will stop carrying swords altogether for self-defense because you can now put a pistol in your pocket and stay safe. And there is a pocket pistol on display in this gallery. Let's see. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more in detail about dueling. Dueling was a hugely popular activity amongst the middle and upper classes for many centuries. It has its origins in the chivalric code of the medieval period when your honor was as much part of your currency as your gold. You being an honorable person was important enough to die for. And in a society where there's no police force, the enforcement of the law might come down to your ability to stand up for yourself in that time. So Francesco Alfieri, 1640, also on display in the gallery, he is a typical dueling treatise from this time. He gives you advice on how to win duels, where to stage them, because dueling was still illegal. The authorities officially banned it, but everybody was doing it. The church didn't like it either, the Catholic Church, but everybody was still doing it because it was fashionable and it was part of their societal fabric. But by the 18th century, as firearms became more widely available, became more efficient, became more reliable, people stopped dueling with swords explicitly, but continued to duel with pistols. However, by the Enlightenment, 1770 to 1820, dueling was very much beginning to fall out of favor with the industrialization of society, the rise of rationalism, and the rise of city-states and nation-states that could clamp down on dueling practices. While researching for this presentation and looking up tracts against dueling, I came across this sermon delivered by, let me see if I can say that name, Eli Falent Knott in 1804 on the death of Alexander Hamilton, popular musical right now. He said, "But I have said and I repeat it, that there are those whom I cannot forgive, I cannot forgive that minister at the altar who has hitherto forborne to remonstrate on the subject. I cannot forgive that public prosecutor who, entrusted with the duty of avenging his country's wrongs, has seen those wrongs and taken no measure to avenge them. I cannot forgive that judge upon the bench or that governor in the chair of state who has lightly passed over such offenses. I cannot forgive the public in whose opinion the duelist finds a sanctuary. I cannot forgive you, my brethren, who till this late hour have been silent while successive murders were committed. The death of Alexander Hamilton in America deeply shook America because he was such an important statesman to be snuffed out over such a trivial offense as the dispute was between him and Aaron Burr. So society is going to backlash against dueling, and its practices are going to fall away very dramatically during that time period. Dueling would still persist into the early 20th century, but by the end of World War I, no one was fighting duels anymore because, quite frankly, the aristocratic classes in Europe that practiced dueling were all killed in the trenches in World War I. By the end of that war, nobody had the stomach for civil violence to settle disputes. That doesn't mean that people stopped fencing. Monsieur Labat and Domenico Angelo wrote treatises on how to fence with the small sword. They presented a type of fencing that's genteel, that's going to appeal to these new sensibilities of gentlemanliness, fair play, and sportiveness. While these are treatises that you can still use for self-defense or dueling, because they still dueled a little bit in that time. If you've ever seen The Duelist, the film, you'll get what I mean. It's showing this shift from martial encounters to sportive encounters. And sportive encounters are still quite popular. Olympic fencing is an event at the Olympics. And here are a couple of illustrations to demonstrate that. On the left is a play from Domenico Angelo's treatise, also on display in this gallery. On the right is a piece of artwork showing fencing in a gentleman's parlor about 1815. You can see they've got fencing masks on, they're wearing jackets, everybody else is quite dapper all around them. They're here to have fun, pure and simple. So then, to tie off the narrative, in the late 19th century, we have Cold Steel on display in the gallery, written by Captain Alfred Hutton, who was a gifted fencer and a British Army officer during the Victorian era. He was the first modern historical European martial arts researcher. He actually went back into the past to try and see how swords were used then, so the British Army could become more proficient at using swords during his time. And he saw quite a lot of sword combat during his deployments in India and so forth. And his works on fencing actually influenced the British Army's practices right until the days of World War I, at which point trench warfare, machine guns, and modern artillery, at that point pretty surely ended the practicality of bayonet charges and sword fighting on the battlefield. So these are just some of the echoes of steel that are reverberating to this day, because modern armies still train in martial arts. And there are people who still fence for fun. These echoes tell us about the history of that time. I do not believe it is possible to get a full picture of what European society was like during these eras of interest without appreciating their martial angle, because it is part of our humanity, that struggle against nature, against fellow man, and against the soul. So I ask you, what echoes do you hear today? What echoes of steel reverberate in your ears? Where have you seen martial arts of Europe impact your life, or your media appreciations, your video game tastes? And then finally, maybe you'd like to make some echoes of your own. It's possible to study historical martial arts today and delve into this field and enjoy it for the richness that it has to present to all of you. Thank you so much for listening to me talk to you today. Thank you for coming out to this reception. We'll be going to the gallery in just a moment. I'd like to really thank all my co-curators who made this possible. Lacey, Nolan, Tim, RJ, Jonathan, Brian, and Norman. Could not have done it without you guys. Thank you very much for listening to me. So if we're ready, let's go over to the gallery and take a look.